15. Jenna was standing only a few yards from the ghost tree when she saw her father. He was sitting next to Michael Mackenzie, his head bowed in conversation only inches from the boys. When her father saw her, he smiled and waved, beckoning her forward. Amy took her hand and pulled gently, but Jenna couldn't seem to move. She wasn't sure her legs would carry her. They felt as wobbly as two rubber bands. She began to scream at Amy to let her go. Somewhere in the distance she heard her mother's voice, felt a hand gently shaking her shoulder. Jenna felt as if she were caught between two worlds. She struggled to answer the voice, but it was as if she were under water and trying to talk to someone on the surface. Someone was rocking Jenna back and forth. In the dream, it was Amy who, more persistent than ever, was pushing her forward. But it was her mother's voice that Jenna kept hearing. She tried to open her eyes. Her lids ached with the effort. "Jen?" Jenna forced her eyes open and blinked. Her mother was sitting on the edge of her bed. "I heard you cry out. I thought something was wrong." "I did?" Jenna's tongue felt thick. "Were you having a bad dream?" Jenna closed her eyes and once again saw her father waving to her from beneath the ghost tree. "Yes, a bad dream." "You want to talk about it?" She shook her head. "I'm okay." Still disoriented, she began to massage her eyes. "What are you doing up?" Her mother shrugged. "I was watching an old movie." She stared into the dimly lit hallway. "I don't seem to be sleeping very well these days." Jenna didn't know what to say, so she simply put her hand on her mother's. Meredith patted Jenna's hand and stood up. "I'd better try to get some rest. I've got 2 major meetings tomorrow morning." She stopped in the doorway. "If you need to talk, though, just wake me, okay?" Jenna nodded. "Thanks." Images of the dream continued to haunt her, so when she still hadn't fallen asleep an hour later, she crept downstairs to make a cup of herbal tea. She turned on the light above the stove and put the water on to boil, all the while thinking about this latest dream. She rummaged through the numerous boxes of herbal tea, but nothing appealed to her. Instead, she decided to make a cup of hot chocolate, although she could not have said why. Hot chocolate was for frosty nights. It was only early September. Minutes later, sitting at the oak table, watching the steam rise from her cup, inhaling the rich smell of chocolate, she had a sudden vision of a younger Jenna holding out a gloved hand to take a thermos mug of steaming hot chocolate from her father. She closed her eyes, and suddenly she was 11 years old again. She could see the ghost tree up ahead just as it had looked on that day 4 years before, the bare, mottled white branches shooting skyward in the frosty evening, made even whiter by the snow. Her father had brushed the snow from the spot where the 3 trunks grew out of a base that was as big around as a large kitchen table, making a seat for her. She had climbed into the tree and sat while he made a tent of bare branches and loose bark beneath a tight huddle of pine trees. The snow wasn't at all deep there, and when he was finished building the small shelter, he placed alfalfa and apples inside. They had come to the great swamp to feed the animals, as they had every winter since she could remember. But this particular winter had been unusually harsh, and the deer were having a hard time finding food. Her father had wanted to create some place sheltered to leave the apples and alfalfa so that if it snowed again, they wouldn't get buried. It was almost sundown, and he was hurrying because he didn't want them to be in the woods when it got dark. The cold had chapped her cheeks, and her fingers stung inside her wool gloves, even though she held the steaming cup of hot chocolate her father had given her. But here, in the cradle of the tree, watching the fiery glow of the setting sun as it dipped below the horizon, Jenna had felt warm and happy. And later, as she and her father headed back to the car, he had told her the legend of the ghost tree. He said that no one really knew where it had come from. Some people claimed the Native Americans from the area, the Lenape tribe, had started the legend over 300 years ago. The tree was that old, even older maybe. The Lenape supposedly believed it was a sacred place where you could communicate with the spirits of your ancestors. But no one had the slightest idea whether the legend was true or not, because it was the white settlers who had given the old sycamore the name Ghost Tree. Legends sometimes got mixed up that way. But her father had told her that according to the legend, if you spent the night in the cradle of the old sycamore, the spirits of your ancestors, all of them, from the beginning of time, would form circles around the tree, chanting their stories and sharing their wisdom with you as they danced through the night. It was, her father said, a place of healing. Jenna stared down at her hot chocolate. She had only taken one swallow, and now it was lukewarm. She thought of going back to bed, but she knew she wouldn't be able to sleep. It was pointless to try to shut out the image of the ghost tree and the memories it had awakened. She wanted to understand why she was so haunted by this place, because in a strange way she felt as if her life depended on it. The next morning, Jenna was surprised to find her mother still at home. It was Friday, a few days before Labor Day, and her mother had said she had important meetings that morning. Jenna stood in the doorway of her mother's bedroom watching her fold a sweatsuit and put it in a large trash bag. The windows were open and the curtains swelled like gently billowing sails in the breeze. She welcomed the sounds of the traffic below as they mingled with the chirping of birds, grateful that the house no longer had the mausoleum chill of the central air conditioning. "How come you're still home?" she asked. When Meredith Ward looked over at her, Jenna saw that her eyes were puffy and wet. "I'm having a bad day." "What about your meetings?" "I asked someone to fill in for me." Jenna sat down at the foot of the bed. Her mother sat down next to her, clutching a sweater she had started to fold, and put her arm around her daughter. "It's so hard," she said. "So much harder than I ever imagined." Jenna rested her head on her mother's shoulder. "Maybe you could talk to somebody. She had been about to say a minister, but suddenly felt like a hypocrite. Her own feelings about God were still all mixed up with her anger and resentment. Even now, weeks after the accident, when people tried to comfort her with idiotic statements telling her that her father's death was simply part of God's plan, she wanted to grab them by the shoulders and shake them until their eyes popped out. She looked up at her mother's face and for the first time realized how terribly lonely her mother must be. It wasn't that she didn't have friends. She did. She went shopping at the mall with them, or to shows, or out to dinner. In fact, it seemed at times that there was some kind of conspiracy between them to keep their widowed friend busy. But Jenna knew that her mother's friends could never fill the void left by her father. Her mother wiped her eyes with the sleeve of the sweater. "My friends have been good listeners," she said. A strand of damp hair clung to her cheek. She pushed it behind her ear and smiled. "And I have you." Jenna lifted the balled-up sweater from her mother's hands. It was a burgundy wool crew neck Jenna had given her father 2 Christmases ago. She could still see him putting the sweater on right over his bathrobe, as if he couldn't wait to try it on. He had always made a big deal of her gifts. Jenna was suddenly aware of the piles of clothing stacked all over the room, on the bed, the dresser, and even the floor. A trash bag sat on the floor by her mother's feet. "You're not throwing Daddy's things away, are you?" Jenna asked, alarmed. "I'm not throwing his things away," her mother said. "I'm giving them away to people who can use them. It's better than having them collect dust in the closet, isn't it?" Jenna stroked her father's sweater as if it were a kitten curled up on her lap. She supposed giving her father's clothes to charity was the right thing to do. She set the sweater back on the bed and wandered over it to the walk-in closet. Her father's suits and shirts still lined one entire wall. 2 months had passed since the accident, yet it had never occurred to her that there would come a time when they would be giving away his clothes. What about all Daddy's tools?" she asked. "The workshop, his sacred space. Were they going to pack that up too?" Even with her back to her mother, Jenna heard her heavy sigh. "Maybe Mr. Krebs next door will want some of them, or maybe his son," she said. Or I suppose we could have a yard sale or something." Of course they wouldn't keep the tools. What would they do with them? Still, the thought of some stranger using them made Jenna want to cry. Brushing back tears, she lifted 2 of the suits from the metal bar, carried them over to the bed, and began to fold them. "I think we should save the tools for a while." She glanced over at her mother. "Who knows, maybe I'll turn out to be pretty handy at fixing things. Maybe it's hereditary or something." Meredith gently ran her thumbs over Jenna's damp cheeks. "I guess we could keep them for a while longer," she agreed. Jenna suddenly remembered that she was supposed to meet Andrea. They were going to the pool later that morning, but somehow, being here, packing up her father's things, seemed more important. With each shirt she folded, with each sweater, with every pair of jeans, she found herself saying goodbye. Over and over, the silent goodbyes echoed in her heart, a goodbye to each and everything, because she had never gotten the chance to say it on that fateful morning in July.